The American Civil War was fought between the free Union states in the North and the slave-owning Confederate states in the South. It was the first conflict in which railways played a major role. Both sides made extensive use of them for moving supplies and reinforcements to where they were needed, and both sides would regularly launch raids to disrupt the other's essential rail operations. One such raid, in April of 1862, manifested itself as an epic chase halfway across Georgia, and a battle of wits that would go down as one of the most bizarre operations in military history. This was the Great Locomotive Chase. In April 1862, the war was going well for the North, particularly in Tennessee. They had seized the key river guards at Forts Henry and Donaldson and Island No. 10. They had captured the state capital at Nashville, beaten off a fierce counterattack at Shiloh, and were now pushing south towards the Memphis and Charleston Railroad, the capture of which would cut the only direct east-west rail link in the South. While the main force under General Buell was pushing towards the key rail junction at Corinth, a smaller force under Major General Ormsby Mitchell was pushing south to cut the line at Huntsville. From there, he hoped to swing east towards the city of Chattanooga. Chattanooga controlled most of the road and rail links into East Tennessee. If it could be taken and held, the Confederates would likely have to abandon Tennessee altogether. It would also provide the Union with a springboard from which to march through Georgia and split the Confederacy in two. The problem was, while Chattanooga was only lightly held, once it was threatened, the Confederates could use the Western and Atlantic Railroad to rush reinforcements up from Atlanta. The solution was supplied to Mitchell by a notorious Union spy and saboteur called James J. Andrews. He would lead a covert raid to put the Western Atlantic Railroad out of action in a single day, and do enough damage that it would be days, if not weeks, before the Confederates could repair it, which would allow the Union to win the reinforcement race. His plan was to smuggle a handful of Union soldiers through the lines. They would steal a train from just north of Atlanta, cut telegraph cables to stop word getting out, and pull up track behind themselves to deter pursuit. They would then speed north, wrecking as much as they could behind themselves. All being well, they would speed through Chattanooga and head west to link up with the advancing Union forces, being welcomed as heroes. Andrews had planned this raid meticulously. He had spent a week riding up and down the line, taking careful note of all the stops and schedules, together with the fuel stops, and the locations of the best targets for sabotage. In particular, he hoped to knock out the main rail bridges at the Etowah and Oostenaula rivers. If burnt, these would be the hardest to repair. Beyond, there were a number of smaller covered bridges over the Chickamauga Creek. Mitchell agreed to sponsor this plan, since he would be risking very little, but if successful, the reward would be great. He put out a call for volunteers from amongst his force. 23 men came forward individually. Armed with carbines, they dressed in civilian clothes and made their way south in small groups, telling anyone who asked that they were Kentuckians who wished to join the Confederate Army. Along the way, 2 of them found themselves in a corner and had to actually join the Confederate Army to maintain their cover, which they deserted at the first opportunity. 2 more overslept on the morning of the raid and missed the start. But 20 men were available for the operation, including Andrews himself. They gathered in a hotel room in Marietta, where Andrews explained the finer details of the plan to them. The operation had been scheduled for the 11th of April to coincide with Mitchell's advance, but had been delayed by a day due to bad weather. However, on the 11th, Mitchell was able to capture Huntsville without incident. Some of the raiders suggested they should call it off on these grounds, but Andrews insisted the raid go ahead to facilitate further advances. At 4 o'clock the next morning, a northbound service left Atlanta, pulled by a locomotive known as the General. Managing this train was a well-experienced conductor known as William Allen Fuller. At 5:05, the train stopped in Marietta, where the raiders had bought tickets to lots of destinations. They boarded the train separately and made their way to the front, awaiting further instructions. At 5:20, the train stopped at Big Shanty. This was a special 20-minute rest stop to allow the crew and most of the passengers to disembark for breakfast. Here, Andrews gave the signal to go. He had chosen this stop carefully. Not only would the General be unattended and under steam for 20 minutes, but there was no telegraph station at Big Shanty to get the word out. The only snag was the nearby military base at Camp MacDonald. But this was more of a false sense of security, as Camp MacDonald was staffed by raw cadets, most of whom were armed with pikes. The General was pulling 3 empty boxcars, followed by a baggage car, followed by the passenger cars. This was an ideal arrangement for their purposes. The raiders quietly made their way up the train, uncoupling everything to the rear of the boxcars. Most of them climbed into the empty boxcars, while Andrews and the crew climbed into the engine. They opened up the throttle and sped away north. Fuller and his crew had just sat down to breakfast when they heard the sound of the engine and realised somebody was making off with their train. Enraged and bound by a sense of duty, Fuller took off after them on foot. Just outside town, the General abruptly ground to a halt. The crew had dampened the furnace before they'd gone for breakfast, and they needed to stop and prime it. This only cost them a couple of minutes, but it almost allowed Fuller to catch up. Several of the raiders were taking aim at the pursuers, but fortunately for them, the General started moving again just before they came within range, and soon left them behind. The General had a top speed of around 95 kilometers an hour, or 60 miles an hour, and was regarded as one of the fastest engines on the line. However, early on, the raiders had to keep it to its usual running speeds, which were more like 25 kilometers an hour, or 16 miles an hour. The Western Atlantic Railroad was single track for most of its length, with passing loops built in to allow trains to pass. The raiders would need to reach these at the scheduled times if they were to pass southbound traffic. The other problem they faced was that they had no equipment for conducting actual sabotage. Andrews hoped to acquire this as they went along. However, rail workers tend to be very familiar with the usual running of lines, and perceptive if things aren't right. When the General pulled up outside the yard at Moon Station, the yard workers there were confused by its unfamiliar crew, its early arrival, and its lack of carriages. Fortunately, Andrews had planned for this. He had prepared a cover story that he was a Confederate official who'd been ordered to take charge of this train to move a special cargo of ammunition to the Confederate troops defending Corinth, and that a replacement service would be along shortly with the General's carriages. The yard workers bought this story and allowed Andrews to borrow a crowbar when asked. Once out of sight of the station, the raiders stopped by a pile of spare sleepers by the track. They collected most of them and piled them into the empty boxcars for use in bridge burning later on, together with whatever kindling they could find. They used some more to build a barricade on the tracks, throwing in some telegraph poles for good measure. At the same time, they sent a man shimmying up a telegraph pole to cut down the cable using a saw they'd found in the General. They took the length of cable with them so it couldn't easily be spliced back together. The raiders sped through Allatoona without stopping, much to the frustration of the waiting passengers and the amusement of the raiders. Once beyond, they stopped to take down more telegraph cables, and decided this would be a good time to tear up track. It was slow going, with only the one crowbar to work with, and a few sleepers to act as leverage. Plus, the raiders hadn't eaten all day. Nonetheless, they succeeded, and took the rail with them in the boxcar. With the line broken and the telegraph cables cut, the raiders felt that they were in the clear. Unfortunately, Andrews's careful planning hadn't accounted for the tenacity of William Fuller. Fuller had run the 4 kilometres or 2.4 miles from Big Shanty to Moon Station. Once there, he tried to use the telegraph to get the word out, but found the line dead. He did, however, locate a handcar, which he could use to give chase. It was a low flatbed design, propelled by long poles. It had to be pushed uphill, but could pick up decent speeds on downhill or level sections. Up ahead, the raiders had reached the Etowah Bridge, one of the bridges that Andrews had prioritised for burning. Had it been dry, they could have burned it simply by throwing coals out of the engine as they went over. Unfortunately, it had been raining heavily in the days leading up to the raid, and it was still lightly raining on the day. Burning the soaked bridge would require them to stop and build a much more sizable fire, something which would take time and make it hard to follow the general's schedule. And so Andrews decided to leave the Etowah Bridge unburnt. Instead, they would focus on reaching the Oosternaula Bridge, which contained a covered section which would make burning it a lot easier. And there would be no schedule to worry about by this time, so they would have all the time they needed. Once it was burnt, they would have the track to themselves beyond to burn the covered bridges over the Chickamauga. Continuing north, they came to the junction with a spur line which led off to the Cooper Iron Works. Near the end of this line, they spotted an engine called the Yonah under steam. Some of the raiders suggested they should stop and wreck it to stop it being used against them, something which would have been as simple as opening up the throttle and jumping out, sending it speeding down the line. However, the junction was guarded. It was a small guard, and they probably could have taken them, but Andrews chose not to take the risk. He believed any pursuing party would take so long to reach here that the Yonah wouldn't make any difference. It was a sound judgment, but it would prove a mistake. To the south, Fuller was continuing his handcar pursuit. When they came across the raiders' barricades, they picked up the handcar and carried it to the other side. By now, Fuller was realising that the train thieves were not random deserters as he'd first suspected, but a more organised effort. He made sure to arm his party at the next station. Further on, they came to the rail that the raiders had lifted. Unable to stop in time, the handcar was overturned and the pursuers thrown out. But no one was badly hurt, and the handcar was undamaged, so they were able to pick it up and carry on once more. Up ahead, the raiders were tearing down more telegraph cables. This time, they had found a way to speed things up. They'd rigged up a long hooked pole, which they used to snag a cable, and then tied it onto the boxcar, ripping down entire lengths in one go, and taking some telegraph poles with it, which would fall on the lines and create impromptu barricades. At Cass Station, they stopped for the general's scheduled refuelling. While there, Andrews persuaded a slightly gullible station master to hand over a copy of the day's schedule, but he was unable to acquire any more tools or any more fuel oil. After tearing down more telegraph cables, the raiders reached the rail junction at Kingston. Kingston Yard was a busy place, with some soldiers on patrol, and it was not somewhere the raiders wished to get into a fight. Most of the raiders waited quietly and nervously in the boxcars, whilst Andrews repeated his cover story to the staff there, that he was a Confederate official moving a gunpowder train to Corinth, and that a replacement train would be along with the general's carriages. Nonetheless, they would have to wait 15 minutes for a southbound goods train to pass. However, this train was 15 minutes late. When it did arrive, Andrews directed it into a passing loop, but the driver brought with him some alarming news. With Chattanooga seemingly about to fall, the city was being evacuated. 2 extra trains had been put on to move equipment and rolling stock to the south, and so the raiders were going to have to wait a bit longer. The driver questioned the wisdom of Andrews' special ammunition train, given that Huntsville had fallen and there would be no way through by rail. Andrews responded that he had his orders and he refused to believe that the Yankees had got that far. He threw himself into the role, acting as if his frustration at the delay was due to the importance of his special train, and not due to the knowledge that for every minute they were waiting there, pursuers would be gaining ground. The pursuers were speeding over the unburnt Etowah Bridge. They were delighted to come across the Yonah with a full head of steam and took charge of the engine, taking its guards with them on board for armed backup. Finally, with an engine to work with, Fuller sped up the line, knocking aside the raiders' barricades as he went. Back in Kingston, what should have been a 15-minute wait had dragged on to at least an hour and 15 minutes, and the yard workers were getting suspicious. The replacement train that Andrews had claimed was right behind his was yet to materialise, and Andrews was at a loss as to explain why. Finally, the last of the southbound goods trains had arrived and been moved out the way. The raiders could now finally go. But a suspicious signalman refused to set the points. Andrews responded by angrily setting them himself, and then sped away as the signalman threatened to have him arrested. Minutes later, the pursuers arrived and found every main line and passing loop blocked by goods trains. With no time to move them aside, Fuller abandoned the Yonah and ran to the head of the traffic jam. There he took charge of the Rome Railroad engine known as the William R. Smith, an older and underpowered design, but the one best positioned to give immediate chase. Taking soldiers and rail workers with him in the carriage, he sped after the raiders. To the north, the raiders had stopped to cut down more telegraph cables and tear up more track. They heard the sound of an engine and realised for the first time just how closely they were being pursued. Panicking, they yanked on the rail so hard it actually snapped. With the line thus broken, they sped away. The pursuers stopped just short of the broken track. Not wanting to waste time repairing it, Fuller set off on foot once more, though only his main crew were willing to follow him. He knew there were still 2 more southbound services ahead, and hoped to link up with one of them. The raiders too knew that these trains would be coming, but if they could bypass them quickly and tear up track, they would have the line to themselves all the way to Chattanooga. They came across the first of these services, pulled by an express engine known as the Texas. It was waiting in a passing loop in Adairsville for the raiders to pass. As they passed, Andrews warned the Texas's crew that they should proceed slowly, as there was trouble down the line. However, the Texas's crew gave them the same warning, as they were likely to encounter an engine called the Catosa further up the track. Andrews ignored this warning and took the General to full speed, determined to beat the Catosa to the passing loop at Calhoun. This he succeeded in, and directed the Catosa into the loop. However, the Catosa's driver stopped with its rearmost carriages still sitting on the main line, and the impatient raiders set off as soon as it was stationary, only just stopping in time to avoid a collision. This led to a heated argument between the 2 crews, which ended with Andrews asserting his superiority once more and directing the Catosa on. The raiders were now in the clear, with nothing ahead of them. It all depended on whether they'd done enough to throw off the pursuers. Fuller flagged down the Texas as it made its way south. He explained the situation and took charge of the engine, dropping off the Texas's carriages in a siding. There was no way to turn the engine round, but this wasn't much of an issue, as the Texas could run just as fast in reverse, with Fuller stood on the tender to act as lookout. At Calhoun, they came across the Catosa still parked in the passing loop. Fuller was delighted to hear that the raiders were only a few minutes ahead. While there, they also came across a telegraphist who'd been on his way south to find out why the line had gone dead. Fuller took him on board, noting down a message for him to transmit when he got the opportunity. He then set off after the raiders, regularly blowing the whistle to intimidate them. The Katosa's crew, meanwhile, dropped off their own carriages and flagged down a passing militia patrol. They set off north themselves in case Fuller might need some armed backup. Up ahead, the raiders had stopped to tear down more telegraph cables and were just in the process of loosening a rail so they could rip up more track, when they heard the sound of an engine and saw the Texas speeding up the line towards them. This time, it was clear they wouldn't have time to finish ripping up track. With all subtlety gone, the raiders suggested they should ambush the Texas. But Andrews was concerned that the Texas may be carrying armed soldiers, as opposed to 7 mostly unarmed rail workers. He decided the best plan was to run, and to try to stop the Texas by other means. Fuller was delighted to spot his train for the first time since it was stolen. He had the Texas slowed to ease it over the weakened rail. Andrews hadn't put much faith in the weakened rail to stop them, and so he'd left behind a boxcar to act as a further barrier. Had the Texas been facing forwards, this might have stopped them altogether, as it would have pressed down on the cowcatcher. But with the Texas reversed, all they had to do was couple on the boxcar and continue the pursuit. The raiders knocked holes in the boxcars, which they could use to observe the pursuers' progress, and also throw sleepers onto the track to slow them down. However, due to the speed they were moving, most of these sleepers bounced harmlessly away. Those that did land slowed the pursuers by a couple of minutes at a time, while they reduced speed and sent a runner ahead to clear the way. This didn't grant the raiders time to tear up track, certainly not enough time to burn bridges, and so they had to leave the Euston-Orla Bridge unburnt. However, the long slope leading up from the Euston-Orla River gave them another opportunity. They stopped near the summit and uncoupled another boxcar, which they gave a quick shove backwards, sending it freewheeling down the slope. However, the pursuers were able to spot this boxcar coming. They quickly reversed the Texas and gently caught the boxcar. They dropped off the captured boxcars in Resaca. This did at least buy the raiders some time, which was good because they needed to make a fuel stop. They pulled up at Greenswood Station and hurriedly threw as much wood as they could into the tender. They found a lot of it to be damp, which would limit their power, and they didn't have time to fill the tender altogether, just hoping this would be enough to get to the next fuel depot. At Tilton, they stopped for water, but as the Texas bore down on them once more, they had no choice but to speed away with the tender only a quarter full. At the junction at Dalton, they made another quick stop to ensure the points were set correctly. That taken care of, they sped through Dalton Yard so quickly they almost overturned the boxcar. 2 minutes later, the pursuers reached Dalton and slowed to drop off their telegraphist, who ran into the telegraph office and was finally able to get a message through to Chattanooga. This message was cut off midway through, as the raiders tore down more telegraph lines, but enough of it got through to let the garrison know what was happening. They rushed south of the city, pulled up a rail, and set up infantry and artillery to meet the raiders. At the same time, they sent alerts to local patrols, telling them to converge on the line. The raiders' fate was now effectively sealed. The raiders suspected that word might have got ahead, but they had no choice but to press on as fast as they could push the general. If they could find a way to stop the Texas, they might still have time to burn some bridges and at least achieve something that day. They were approaching the long tunnel at Tunnel Hill. They had no gunpowder to collapse the tunnel, but some of the raiders hoped to use the darkness to their advantage, especially since with the Texas reversed, their headlamp would be useless. In the darkness, they could set an ambush and do some serious damage, whether the Texas was carrying soldiers or not. But once again, Andrew shied away from getting into a fight. But just the threat of an ambush was enough to lead the pursuers to slow down and proceed cautiously through the tunnel. Andrews hoped to use this delay to enact a new plan of how to stop them. With a covered bridge coming up, he ordered the raiders to start a bonfire in the back of the boxcar, whilst they relocated into the tender. The plan was that they would drop it off on the covered bridge, with little luck setting light to it. Unfortunately, all the wood they were working with was damp, and starting a fire was easier said than done. They managed to get it smoking and smoked out the boxcar's interior, but they couldn't get any decent fire going by the time they'd reached the bridge, and so, once more, they had to carry on, leaving the bridge unburnt. With the boxcar smoked out, and their pile of sleepers smouldering within it, throwing them onto the track became a lot more difficult. Worse still, the general was rapidly running out of fuel. They ripped chunks off the boxcar and threw them into the furnace together with anything else which would burn, but it was a losing battle. And with the Texas right behind them, they couldn't stop and refuel. By the time they'd made it through Ringgold, speed was beginning to drop sharply, and the raiders decided to call it quits. With a bend between themselves and the pursuers, they bailed out and scattered into the woods. Their driver attempted to reverse the general as he went, but there was no power to get it up to speed, and so the engine simply ground to a halt, bringing the great locomotive chase to an end. 7 hours and 142 kilometres or 88 miles from Big Shanty where it had begun. The raid ultimately did very little damage. The rails they'd lifted and the telegraph lines they'd torn down had been replaced within hours, and by the next day the line was back to normal operation. Mitchell was able to capture Huntsville and was promoted to Brigadier General for it. However, he never received the reinforcements he needed to press on to Chattanooga. The failure of the raid was of no immediate consequence to him, but had it succeeded, there is a good chance he could have seized Chattanooga with what he had, significantly shortening the war. As it was, it would be a year and a half before Chattanooga could be taken and secured. The raiders tried to make their way north, but they were lost, malnourished, and facing an enemy who'd been put on alert for them. Within 2 weeks, all of them had been captured, including 2 who hadn't even taken part in the raid. They were taken to trial in Atlanta. Ironically, the general was used to take them there. There, they were convicted as spies and thieves. Several of them were then brought to trial individually, and Andrews and 7 of the raiders were hanged. However, at this stage, the Confederates seemed to have lost interest in them, and the remaining raiders were left in a prison cell awaiting an uncertain future. They later organised a jailbreak, which allowed 8 of them to escape and make it home. The other 6 were returned in a prisoner exchange in March of 1863. Though the raid made little difference in the greater scope of things, it provided a great deal of excitement on both sides. It also spooked the Confederates into increasing their guard on their bridges and their stations, which made any future such raids very difficult. However, guarding all the bridges in Georgia required them to withdraw 1,000 troops, who were badly needed on the front lines. Despite their failure, the raiders were greeted as heroes upon their return home. 19 of the raiders became the first ever recipients of a new Valor Commendation known as the Medal of Honor. Thank you all for watching. Don't forget to like, share and subscribe if you would like to see more content like this. I am currently focusing entirely on the train videos as that's where most of the interest seems to be, and I have a lot that I'm interested in making. I have plans for more one-off videos like this, as well as future series covering the history of railways in other countries, so do stay tuned for those. I will return to my Thames series at a later date. If you would like to support this channel further, I have a Ko-fi page where you can leave a donation or you can commission a video or a drawing. You can also check out my artwork on my website and my Etsy pages. Links to all these in the description. I hope to see you soon.